June 1369. The moment the swords went down, everyone expected the worst. Not mercy, not conversation, not time to breathe. The fight had ended badly and fast. A scouting raid that went too far, a hedge line crossed too late, a patch of wet ground that swallowed horses and turned formation into panic. When it was over, a small group of mounted men stood disarmed in a shallow field, mud caked to mail, breath loud inside their helmets. No banners waved, no cheers followed, just silence, broken by the sound of water moving somewhere nearby. They were knights and men-at-arms, trained from youth to expect a narrow set of outcomes in defeat. Death on the field. Ransom if fortune smiled. The rope if someone wanted an example. What they did not expect was to be told to stand, adjust their cloaks, and walk. No blows fell, no hands bound them. A sergeant pointed down the road and spoke plainly. "You'll keep your pace, you'll keep your boots. Try nothing clever." It was not a threat, it was instruction. One of the younger men whispered, "This isn't right." Another answered under his breath, "They mean to sell us." That made sense. Knights were worth money. Armor could be counted. Names could be written. A living prisoner was an asset. But the road they were led onto raised questions. It did not run toward a fortress or a keep. It cut through working land. On either side stretched fields already cut low, stubble sharp against the soil. Cart tracks ran deep, pressed by repeated loads. A pair of peasants paused in their work to watch the column pass, not fearful, not curious, simply attentive, as if this was not the first group of armed men they had seen this season. A boy carried a sack toward a distant building and did not look back. "This isn't a holding march," one man muttered. "This is someone's afternoon." They walked for hours. No one rushed them. No one dragged them. When a man stumbled, he was allowed to catch his balance. That mercy felt colder than cruelty. It suggested planning. As the sun shifted, the sound grew louder. Not voices, not bells. Something heavier, repeating. A deep rolling force that rose and fell without pattern. Several of the men noticed it at once. "What is that?" someone asked. "A forge," said another, uncertain. "No," said a third. "Too steady." They crested a small rise and saw stone ahead. Not a wall, not a tower. A wide-backed structure sunk low to the ground, built thick and square, hugging the riverbank. Water moved fast here, forced into a narrow cut, channeled hard against timber and iron. And there, set into the flow, was a wheel so large that it dwarfed the men standing beside it. The column slowed without being told. The wheel turned with a patience that felt wrong. It did not surge. It did not strain. It accepted the river and bent it to its own rhythm. Each rotation carried weight. Each splash struck the ear like a drumbeat muffled by distance. The prisoners had seen siege frames hauled by oxen, seen stone moved by ropes and sweat. This was different. No one pushed. No one pulled. The guards watched their faces. Inside, the sound swallowed thought. The air smelled of wet wood and ground grain. Gears the height of a man meshed and separated, tooth after tooth, never missing. Shafts ran the length of the building, trembling as they carried motion deeper into the structure. Millstones turned slow and final, grain pouring between them like sand into an hourglass that could never empty. One of the captives reached out without thinking, then stopped short. The guard nearest him shook his head once, not sharply, just enough. "This isn't for war," the miller said, almost kindly. "It's older than that." No one answered him. They were staring at the beams, the joints, the way power disappeared into the floor and returned somewhere else. A knight whispered, If they can do this with water, what else can they move? No one corrected him. No one laughed. They were led back outside and told to sit. Bread was brought, not coarse scraps, real loaves, still warm. Hands hesitated before taking them. Eating felt like agreeing to something unseen. As the wheel kept turning, one thought settled among them, heavy and shared. They had not been brought here by accident. This was not a detour. This was the point. But the road had not ended, and what they were meant to learn was only beginning. The morning came without ceremony. No shouted orders, no chains rattling. The prisoners were told to stand, adjust what armor they still wore, and fall into line. Bread had settled in their stomachs, which made everything feel worse. Hunger was expected. Confusion was not. They were led away from the mill and onto a road that followed the river for a time, then bent inland through fields already alive with work. Plows cut lines into damp soil. Women bent to gather what the harvest had left behind. A cart creaked past them, its wheels repaired with fresh wood, the iron bands still dark from the forge. The driver glanced at the armed column and kept moving. "This land isn't stripped," one of the older knights said quietly. "Not for a war zone." Another answered, "Then the war isn't hurting the right people." That thought lingered as they walked. Villages came and went. Low stone houses clustered around chapels with patched roofs. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children watched from doorways, not hiding, not waving. The prisoners had marched through burned ground before. This was different. The land showed wear, but not ruin. It looked managed. At a crossroads, a reeve spoke with the escort captain. Grain tallies were mentioned, a miller's name, a date. The conversation sounded like account-keeping, not war planning. When the column moved again, one of the captives laughed under his breath. "They're counting sacks while we're still breathing." No one told him to be quiet. By midday, the sun pressed down hard enough to draw sweat under mail. A man-at-arms asked for water. A guard pointed to a trough, fed by a wooden pipe. "Drink there," he said. "Don't foul it." The words were ordinary. The meaning was sharp. This water mattered. They rested near a field where men worked in pairs, their rhythm practiced. One of the prisoners leaned toward a guard and said, "How long have you held this land?" The guard shrugged. "Long enough to learn what keeps it." That answer bothered them more than any insult. It suggested patience, investment, the kind of thinking that did not end with a single campaign. As they resumed the march, the road narrowed. Trees closed in. The river reappeared, wider now, slower, broken by weirs and cuts that guided it like a trained animal. Smaller wheels turned in side channels, driving bellows, lifting hammers, moving saws. Each was protected by a simple fence, nothing grand, nothing guarded. No one feared attack here. One prisoner whispered, "We destroy castles. We burn towns. Why hasn't anyone touched this?" The man beside him answered, "Because everyone needs it standing." That was when the shape of the trap became clear. Not a cage of wood or iron, but a web. Roads, mills, fields, storage, law. Each piece supported the others. Break one, and the rest pulled it back into place. They reached a small manor by evening. Not a fortress. A hall with thick walls and a yard full of tools. The prisoners were housed in a barn, clean enough, dry enough. Straw was laid. Guards were posted, but they sat and talked, passing bread between them. The sound of the river carried even here, steady as breathing. That night, two captives spoke in low voices. "If ransom comes, they'll let us go," one said. "And if it doesn't? Then they'll still feed us," the other replied. "They've already shown us that." Sleep came poorly, not from fear of execution, but from the slow pressure of understanding. These people did not rush. They did not waste. They did not need to terrify prisoners to feel powerful. In the dark, the wheel kept turning, but the next morning would bring them face to face with the purpose behind that calm, and it would be harder to ignore. They were taken back to the river after dawn, but this time not as passing observers. This time they were meant to look closely. The escort split them into small groups and walked them along the bank where the current narrowed and quickened. The river here did not wander. It obeyed. Earth had been cut away to guide it, stones set to keep it from biting back. Water rushed through the channel with a sound that pressed against the chest, as if the ground itself were breathing hard. The great wheels stood ahead, taller than before, now that they were close enough to measure it with their eyes. Thick oak paddles struck the water in steady sequence. Each turn carried weight that could be felt through the soles of their boots. One man muttered, "You could hear this in your sleep." Another replied, "You would never stop hearing it." They were led inside again, deeper this time. Not just the grinding stones, but the bones of the place, the frame, the joints, pegs driven where metal would crack. Grease darkened the wood at points of strain. Everything had been built to be repaired, not replaced. A millwright met them there, sleeves rolled, hands scarred. He did not look impressed by armor or rank. He looked tired. He pointed with a stick as he spoke. "This shaft takes the wheel's turn and carries it forward. These teeth change the speed. Slow here, faster there." He tapped a beam. "Too fast and it burns. Too slow and it wastes." One of the prisoners interrupted him. "And if you wanted to lift stone?" The millwright looked at him for a moment. "Then you'd change the gearing." Another voice cut in. "If you wanted to break walls?" "Same answer," the millwright said. "Different load?" The room went quiet. The implication sat there, heavy. Power was power. Direction was choice. They watched as sacks were hoisted without men straining. Grain poured, measured, weighed. A clerk scratched marks onto a board. Numbers mattered here. Precision mattered. Nothing about this place was hurried, yet nothing was idle. A knight with a scarred cheek leaned toward his companion. "This is a siege engine that never moves." The other answered, "And never stops." Outside, the river kept feeding the wheel. Inside, the wheel fed everything else. Flour for bread, bran for animals. Waste carried away, not left to rot. The system felt closed, complete. One man asked quietly, "How many mouths does this feed?" The clerk answered without looking up, "More than you think." That answer landed harder than any threat. Armies marched on bread. Towns rose where food could be trusted. This was not a weapon you rolled up to a gate. This was one you built beneath a whole region and let time do the work. They were shown a smaller wheel downstream, driving hammers that fell and rose with brutal patience. Thump, lift, thump. Each strike even, each pause measured. One prisoner flinched at the sound. "That," a guard said, "is for cloth." "For cloth," the prisoner repeated. "Not heads." The guard shrugged. "Depends what you put under it." No one laughed. As the tour ended, a question surfaced among them, unspoken but shared. If the enemy could turn water into this kind of force, why hadn't they turned it fully toward war? Why leave such strength tied to grain and cloth? The answer began to form as they were led away. War burned quickly. Fields fed forever. A broken wall could be rebuilt. A broken food system took generations to heal. That night, back in the barn, the talk changed. Less about ransom, less about escape, more about what they had seen. "We thought power was who held the high ground," one said, "or the bigger army." "And now?" another asked. "And now I think it's whoever controls the wheel," he replied. Silence followed. Not agreement, recognition. But understanding the machine was only half of it, and the next lesson would cut closer to the bone. They stopped being shown the mill after that. Instead, they were shown its reach. The prisoners were taken out in pairs over the next days, always under watch, always along the same roads. They passed granaries raised on stone feet to keep rodents out. They passed ovens where loaves were stacked in long rows, marked with simple cuts so each household could recognize its own. They passed storehouses with locks heavier than any door they had seen in a peasant home. At one such stop, an older man-at-arms asked the question everyone had been carrying. "Who owns all this?" The answer came from a clerk, not a guard. "The Lord holds the right. The mill holds the work. The people hold the grain. Everyone holds something." "That sounds fair," the soldier said. The clerk looked at him. "It is not meant to be." They watched peasants arrive with sacks slung over their backs, names spoken aloud, amounts recorded. A man tried to argue about a measure. The clerk listened, corrected the mark, and waved him through. No shouting, no violence, just rules, the kind that lasted. A knight who had led men into battle whispered, "This is command without shouting." Another answered, "And obedience without fear." They were fed again that night, always enough, never excess. Bread, thin stew, sometimes cheese. It was impossible not to notice that they were eating the same food as the guards. That detail gnawed at them. It stripped away the comfort of hatred. One evening, a guard finally spoke plainly. "You think mercy keeps you alive. It's usefulness." "For ransom," someone said. "For balance," the guard replied. "Dead men eat nothing. Living ones move grain." That made no sense until the next day, when they were brought to the edge of a field and told to stand aside. A line of peasants waited their turn at the mill, hours long, patient. A woman shifted her child from one hip to the other and said, "If the wheel stops, we all stop." The words were not dramatic. They were factual. The prisoners began to understand the deeper truth. War took men away from fields. Mills made fewer hands necessary. That difference mattered. A place with mills could lose men and still eat. A place without them could not. One of the knights spoke to a miller as they walked. "Why show us this?" The miller wiped his hands on his apron. "Because you fight for castles. We keep them fed." The thought settled slowly. Castles fell, mills stayed. Even when damaged, they were repaired first. Bread came before banners. That night, the men argued quietly. "If we escape," one said, "we warn them. We tell them to burn the mills." "And then what?" another asked. "The land starves, including ours, if it spreads." Silence followed. War had always felt simple before. Break the enemy's strength, take their ground. Now the shape of strength looked different. It looked like a schedule, a ledger, a river trained not to flood or wander. One man finally said, "This is why they don't rush us. They already won." The realization was not sudden. It was heavier than fear. It stripped meaning from heroics and left behind something colder. Control did not need cruelty. It needed continuity. As days passed, ransom talks began. Names were sent. Messengers left. Some men would go home. Others would not, at least not soon. Yet none were beaten. None were starved. That restraint felt deliberate. Violence was expensive. Bread was cheaper. A knight who had lost a brother in battle said quietly, "We were trained to break men." "And they were trained to feed them," another replied. That contrast cut deepest of all. But captivity was nearing its end for some, and the final lesson would come not from chains or freedom, but from choice. The day some of them were released began like every other. Bread, water, names spoken carefully, checked twice. There was no ceremony to mark who would leave and who would stay. No speeches, no gestures meant to be remembered. Those whose ransoms had been agreed upon were brought to the riverbank where a small ferry waited. Coins had already changed hands elsewhere. What mattered now was movement, return, continuity. One of the knights paused before stepping aboard and looked back at the mill. The wheel turned as it always had. No slower, no faster. It did not acknowledge his freedom. A guard noticed and said, "You'll remember it." The knight answered, "I wish I wouldn't." The ferry crossed. Men were handed back their weapons in pieces, not assembled. A courtesy, not a kindness. They were free to leave, but not to threaten. When they reached the far bank, no one followed. Those left behind watched until the figures became small and then disappeared into the trees. No cheers followed. No anger, just the weight of selection. That night, one of the remaining men asked the question that had been circling them for weeks. "Why not keep us all until we break?" The answer came from an older official, a man who had not worn armor in years. "Because broken men cost more than patient ones." That was the last lesson. Power, they realized, was not shown in moments of violence, but in decisions that could wait. It lived in places that did not need to move quickly, in mills that turned while armies marched and died elsewhere, in systems that assumed the future would arrive and planned for it. Some prisoners were eventually exchanged. Others worked off debts as overseers, scribes, labor supervisors. A few never returned home at all. They married locally. They learned the schedules. They became part of the same web that had first frightened them. Years later, stories traveled back with those who did leave. Not tales of torture, not heroics. Stories about a wheel, about bread that never failed, about a place where war passed through but did not decide everything. One former captive spoke to his son by a hearth and said, "We were trained to fight men. We were never trained to fight systems." That sentence carried further than any battle story. It explained defeats that swords never could. The mill did not belong to one lord forever. Rights changed hands. Borders shifted. Armies returned. Yet the wheel stayed, repaired when broken, guarded by need rather than fear. And that is the truth the prisoners carried with them, that the most lasting strength is quiet, that the things which feed people shape history more deeply than the things which kill them, that control over time, labor, and food decides outcomes long before banners meet. If there is a lesson here, it is not about mercy or cruelty. It is about attention, about noticing where power actually lives. It rarely stands on walls. It flows through routines, obligations, and machines that look ordinary until you are forced to depend on them. The river kept flowing, the wheel kept turning, and men who had once believed war was everything learned otherwise. If this story shifted how you think about strength, survival, or the structures that quietly shape daily life, sit with that for a moment. Pass it on to someone who still measures power only by violence and victory. And if stories like this matter to you, stories rooted in real people and real choices, stay with the channel for what comes next.